The road was rough and full of potholes, and the driver must have thought it was great fun to drive at high speed through them with me on the bonnet, trying to hang on for dear life, but finding that there was nothing to hold on to. The windscreen behind me was folded down, with the co-driver's legs on the bonnet, and I felt the muzzle of his rifle in my back and could see that he had his finger close to the trigger. I wondered what would happen to me should I fall off the bonnet, apart from being run over. WD raced right into Speyer and stopped outside a fenced-in tennis court where a large number of prisoners were walking about in the sunshine. One of the guards opened the narrow gate. I felt a rough push from behind, stumbled over a door rail or something, and before I knew it, I was lying flat on my belly inside the court. When I got up and dusted myself down, everyone was laughing. I must have looked very funny in that long coat of mine, for someone called me Wigwam, a name which stuck with me for a long time, and when a year later I played football in the American POW camps, my name still appeared on the sheets as Inside Right Wigwam. I had never really seen any black men from close up before, and there were two of them standing guard outside the door. They looked rather forbidding, and those of us who claimed to know the English language could not understand what they were drawling. All the time, captured soldiers were brought in, sometimes on their own, sometimes in groups. Amongst one lot were 3 or 4 officers, looking even more forlorn than the rest. No one wanted to have much to do with them. There was much wild speculation going the rounds about what was going to happen to us. They ranged from being shot to becoming plantation overseers in Red Indian reservations. Many townspeople were now walking about freely in the streets, though during the hours of darkness a curfew was in force. A lorry arrived at the gate, loaded with cardboard boxes. We had to queue, and each of us received 2 tins. One was called K, and the other C ration. In them we found meat, biscuits, ground coffee, powdered milk, sugar, and sweets. It was as if manna from heaven was raining down on us. For the likes of us, real coffee had been unattainable for years. There was only one cold water tap inside the tennis court. We stirred our powder into it as well as we could, and walked around and drank it like that. We reckoned that with food and beverage of that quantity and quality, we could have conquered Europe and the world. After dark, the temperature dropped sharply, and in the early hours we had ground frost. We had been given cardboard for bedding, which we folded out along the fences. And all those who had to get up and keep walking did not laugh any more about my wigwam coat, in which I lay snugly rolled up. I thought about the coldest temperature I had encountered in Russia, -54 degrees centigrade. What did this little ground frost matter to me now? Early next morning we were taken away by lorries. Most of the drivers were black, and they drove like devils. One lorry overturned and was lying at the bottom of an embankment. We could hear the shouts and the cries and saw the prisoners crawl out from underneath like eels, those who could still crawl. What a way to die, a day or so after having escaped the war alive. Our first destination was a farm near Baumholder, where we were herded through a tunnel entrance into a large yard with a dung heap in the middle, which was surrounded on all 4 sides by solid buildings. Shortly after, a couple of armies arrived with spades and ordered about a dozen of us, including myself, to dig a trench 6 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and about 20 yards long. Many of us thought that fate had now finally caught up with us, as the measurements were those of a perfect mass grave. Everyone in the yard had become very quiet, except the guards who were driving us on with. I noticed that a concentration of our lads was forming near the entrance, and kept a close eye on it. I had no doubt that it would be easy to overpower the guards and take their weapons from them, and was already measuring up the nearest of them and planning what to do with him. When we had dug about 3 feet deep, a lorry arrived with drums of chemicals, to be spread over the corpses, we thought, and wooden beams, which we thought could be for gallows. Cold panic had spread to everyone by the time a German-speaking army with hammers and a bucketful of long nails arrived, who asked for carpenters, and explained that he wanted a structure to be set up over the trench, with 2 long beams running parallel to each other from end to end. It was only then that we suddenly understood what the trench and the beams were all about, and the word Scheisshaus went around like a spark. The guards looked puzzled as to why their strange German captives suddenly laughed loudly, and all had happy expressions on their faces. I noticed a number of SS men sitting together in a corner of the yard who were trying to remove the SS insignia from their uniforms. Their arrogance had completely gone, and they looked rather sheepishly at me. When I pointed out that their uniforms were after all a different cloth and colour and cut, they shrugged their shoulders, probably hoping that the Americans did not know. In the long run it did not do them any good, as their blood group was tattooed into their skin underneath their armpits, which no one could erase. German thoroughness in this case had backfired on them. During the night many new prisoners were brought in, and in the morning there was standing room only. A large lorry convoy took us from there across the Belgian border to the garrison town of Stenay, where we were unloaded onto a broad meadow which stretched along a narrow river behind the old Napoleonic barracks. On the field stood large round tents. In each of them the ground area was covered with large boulders. About 20 of us were ordered into each tent, and when we started to shift the boulders out, we were stopped by the guards. We soon found that complaining was no good, and that we just had to make the best of it. We had several horrible nights. None of us could stretch out on the ground, and we either curled up somehow around the boulders or sat on them all night. Nobody was allowed to go outside except to the lavatory, and we heard the guards laughing about us. The next trek took us to the railway station, where a long train of open coal wagons was awaiting us behind a steam engine. We were lined up on the forecourt and ordered, as a last chance, to throw away all our weapons like pistols, knives, sticks, bottles, and pieces of metal. I had decided to take a bottle of water with me, which I had hidden under my wigwam coat. After the last warning had been given, spot checks were made, and it was my luck that a big burly army, probably intrigued by the size of my coat, came straight for me, touched me down, and found my bottle. He gave me one mighty blow to my face, which sent me reeling in the dust. I felt blood running out of my mouth and nose, and my immediate reaction was wild fury and the urge to hit back. But when I turned in the dust and saw the legs of other Amys moving towards me, with their machine pistols at the ready, I very quickly cooled down. I realized that one quick movement could easily be my last, and very slowly picked myself up onto my feet, wiping the blood off my face and joining the ranks of my fellow prisoners. The armies swore at me, which I really did not mind, as I could only understand less than half anyway. But what I found hard to swallow were the angry reproaches from some of my mates, who accused me of having created a dangerous provocation which could have involved them all. Between 40 and 50 of us were loaded into each of the open wagons. As there was only enough space for some of us to sit down, most had to stand. Everything we touched was covered in coal dust. The journey lasted about 2 days, and took us through some of the industrial regions of northern France. Not once were we allowed off the wagons. At times we got drenched from rain showers, and with the coal dust from the wagons and the spewing fire and ashes from the engine, we soon looked and felt like painted gollywogs. The whites of our eyes took on a pinkish look from the continuous rubbing. Our lavatory business became an acute problem, as we simply did not have any facilities. We solved the problem in the most simple way. We filled our food tins, and when we came to a crossing, where often a jeering crowd waited for the passing of our train, we emptied the contents over them. Their jeers then turned to furious howls once they realized what they had been covered with. They picked up everything they could lay their hands on and bombarded our innocent mates, who were riding at the end of the train and did not realize what they were being punished for. At Cherbourg, we were unloaded at the main station, where our arrival platform had been barricaded off. It was about midday, and the sun was shining warmly. Our marching column was protected in the town by an American cordon on each side. It did not take long for trouble. The townspeople, only recently subjected to German occupation, quickly realized that the boot was now on the other foot and decided to make the most of it. Having by now developed a thick skin, the jeers and the shouting did not hurt us much, but the hard objects they threw at us did. I too was hit by some missile on the back of my head. Then one of the young Frenchmen made a terrible mistake. Somehow he managed to break through the American cordon, and he must have thought that he could freely lash out at anyone in reach and get away with it. It was his bad luck that he was mistaken. Hardly a command was necessary for the action that followed. He was pulled into our column, and in barely a matter of seconds, While the armies were helpless to intervene, bare fists settled the matter. When he was finally dragged away, the blood on the cobblestones bore witness to man's inhumanity to man. In a way, I look at this as my last action of the war. Some of the guards were smoking, and whenever they threw a butt end on the ground, some of us were diving for it, in what I thought a disgusting manner. There was still very much the Prussian militarist in me. I still believed in pointless honour. The camp was right out of town on top of the cliffs, from where one could see the expanse of the English Channel. On our way, we passed several now deserted Atlantic Wall bunkers. Next to me walked an old sergeant who had defended them on D-Day, and he told me about the murderous bombardment he had endured, about the masses of ships which had suddenly appeared in the morning, and about the ensuing chaos, fear and death all around. Though one could still see the scars of battle on the bunkers, nature had been kind and had begun to cover them with fresh green growth. There was a refreshing soft breeze blowing in from the sea, and everything seemed so peaceful. The large camp was divided into several cages which were separated from each other by high fences and rolls of barbed wire. About 20 large tents stood in each cage, which each took about 100 of us. We slept on the ground, but had ample supplies of cardboard to protect us from the damp and the cold earth. Between the 2 rows of tents was open ground, the size of 3 tennis courts on which we played football and other games. We also organised chess and card competitions, and had lectures on all sorts of subjects. Each cage had a German leader and interpreter, whose jobs were to carry out the American orders. Everything worked fairly smoothly. The food was excellent, probably the same as our captors were eating, and far better than we had received in our own army. Each of us was given an American mess tin, which we had to rinse in special chemicals before and after using them. The Amies were very particular in all things which concerned safeguarding health. Lavatory and washing facilities were in a tent of their own, and good medical attention was available for all who asked for it. An attempt to delouse us was only partially effective, though. Burly Amis, I think sadistic inclinations must have made them volunteer for the job, filled what looked like thick-barreled bicycle pumps with a white floury powder, which they pressure-pumped into our flies and down our backs and fronts and trouser legs. The result was an awful stinging sensation, and on much coughing and spluttering. We looked like a collection of overworked flour millers who had had no time to wash. At first there seemed a slight relief, but after a few days the eggs in the seams of our uniforms hatched again from the warmth of our bodies, and the lice came back with a vengeance. It was a matter of security, I suppose, that we were issued with spoons only. Even forks were considered to be too dangerous in our hands. But we quickly overcame that restriction by using stones as hammers and anvils, and tearing tins apart. And a few days later, each of us had a complete set of cutlery. There were church services almost every day, and as it was the only chance to get out of the cage, I took part in every single one, never mind which religion they were for. After one of the services, we had a discussion which was led by a young American priest. He personally was prepared to forgive us all for what we had done in the war, but when someone suggested that we also should pray for our victims in Russia, for those who had suffered from our deeds, the priest compared our Eastern campaign with that of the Crusades in the Middle Ages, in which Christianity had defended itself against the godless. Of course, we had heard all that before. It was exactly the line the Nazis had thrown out to justify our barbaric onslaught on the Russian people. And when we reminded the young priest of that, he was a little lost for words. I think it was on the 12th of April when I noticed the stars and stripes at the main gate at half-mast. Roosevelt has died, one of the guards told me, and that bastard Hitler is still among the living. After about 2 weeks, we were marched down to the port and loaded onto a ship. Given 1 blanket each, we bedded down in long rows on the iron floor of the holds. It seemed that the officer in charge did not like us much, for at the far end, next to the iron ladder, stood a huge oil drum with sharp edges which served us all, 500 or so, as the only lavatory. When it was full to the rim, no arrangement was made for having it emptied, and the contents kept slopping over, creating a hell of a stinking mess all round, until an American army doctor made a round of inspection. We crossed the Channel to between the Isle of Wight and Southampton, from where we sailed west, close to the English coast, until we joined up with another large number of ships which must have come, I reasoned, from Bristol. We had learnt at school that the slaves were taken from Bristol to America, and now we were lying in the holds to be taken on the same route, to work in America. Having skirted Ireland, we combined with another huge convoy, which must have set out from Liverpool, and altogether we were now far more than 100 ships. Being allowed on deck during all hours of daylight, I found everything very fascinating to watch. The whole convoy sailed in a zigzag fashion, and a number of destroyers darted in between and everywhere. We watched the dolphins and the flying fish, and after we had overcome the first bouts of seasickness, we enjoyed the good food and the experience as a whole. One evening the sirens wailed and the ship's bells rang. The crew went into a slight state of panic, and we were ordered on deck with our life vests. This was a U-boat alarm, and we had to stand at the railings with our army caps on, possibly so that we should be recognized as German soldiers. It struck me as a final swing of irony that, having fought in Russia for years, it could now be my fate to be sunk in an American Kaiser ship in the middle of the Atlantic by a German U-boat. But shortly after, the sirens howled again, and life returned to normal. We had beautiful sunny days and calm seas, but also very rough days when we found it very difficult to walk with our nailed jackboots on the iron decks. After 21 days, the call came through one morning that land was in sight. Those were magic words, and having scrambled up the steep iron ladder, we saw America rising on the horizon before us. We were greeted by the famous Statue of Liberty, which we had all seen photos of. Having sailed up a short stretch of the Hudson River, New York was there itself, with its mighty bridges, enormous skyscrapers, and the never-ending traffic along the quays. Soon we docked. "America, we have arrived. What are you going to do with us?" We picked up our belongings and walked down the narrow gangway, at the bottom of which stood an officer with a counting machine. Next to him hovered someone who kept shouting, "Schnell! Schnelli!" Coming halfway down, I saw that he had a pin in his hand which he poked into the bottoms of those he could catch. Of course, everyone tried to get past that little fellow as quickly as he could, and we heard later that never before had a troopship been emptied in such record time. How effective a small pin can be. We had arrived on the 8th of May, 1945, and having no idea what was happening anywhere, we were a bit surprised when an army shouted to us while we were still in the holds that the sirens were howling all over New York because Hitler was dead and the war was over. We received the news with a strange and confused feeling. I didn't quite know whether I should feel sad or shout hurrah. We did not even feel like discussing it amongst ourselves, as the dead weight of the Nazi past was lying heavily on us. All us younger ones like myself could not really imagine a Germany without Hitler, and none of us had ever dared say anything adverse about our Führer while he was alive. We could not be all that sure that he was really dead now, anyway. At the quayside, we had to put every single piece of our belongings on the ground before us, and we were thoroughly searched. Since my last payday, I had carried a wad of Reichsmark notes in my breast pocket, which the soldier searching me put into his own. Our troop train consisted of modern coaching stock, and we were surprised by the comfort of the soft seats. On them we found glossy brochures which dealt with German crimes in the concentration camps. The photos shocked us, and at first I believed that they were fakes. But when later on I had a second look, I could see that they were real, and reminding myself of so many events I had witnessed in Russia, the sheer enormity of the crime against humanity I had collectively partaken in, took a clearer conception in my mind. Germany, my Germany, what depth had you fallen to? I found it strange that none of us felt in the mood to even discuss what was in the brochures. Leaving the dock area, we saw much seediness, but found the outlying districts more pleasant to look at. We were impressed and surprised by the many cars in the factory and other car parks. Having in mind that almost no worker in Germany owned a car, we pondered how rich America must be. Workers having cars. We passed through Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Amarillo, and El Paso, all names which to most of us had that touch of mystic. In Oklahoma, the earth was red, and when we crossed the Rockies, pulled and pushed by 3 enormous oil-fired steam engines, we were very impressed. Rolling through the Texas plains, we saw the nodding horses, the oil derricks, and then came the Rio Grande River, which to our surprise was almost dried out and was no more than a trickle. On the other side was Mexico, a neutral country, and the fleeting thought occurred to me of a jump, a short run, and then freedom. But the train rolled on, and there were armed guards on each coach, and having come alive from the steppes of Russia to the Rio Grande, what was the point of risking one's life? After that came the semi-deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, with their enormous cactuses and beautifully shaped mountains with their distinct layers of sandy rock, which were often flat on the top. All the lavatory doors had been removed, so that the guards were able to watch our every activity. The windows were shut all the time, and during the hot day the heating was fully on, and we sweated like pigs, while it was turned off during the cold nights. Travelling somewhere through Texas, a friendly American captain came into our coach and told us that he had been to Germany before the war and had liked it very much. He asked us to sing for him Stille Nacht, the famous German Christmas song. As he seemed a nice man, we tried to please him, but with the sun shining down mercilessly and all of us sweating profusely, we made a croaky start and found that under the unusual conditions it was just impossible to do. The captain understood. We arrived at Florence Camp in the Arizona desert in the early hours of a cool night in the middle of May. Off the train, we were ordered to dump everything we had on, uniform, underwear, boots, caps, belts, etc., onto one big heap, which was doused with petrol and then set alight. To watch it was very hurtful. It was like the cutting of the past from the present, in a very dramatic and symbolic way. There I stood in the grace of God, naked, thin, dirty, and forlorn in a strange country. All I had saved was my wristwatch, while photos and papers, like army paybooks, etc., had earlier been taken away from us and put into envelopes with our names on. We were marched into a large room in a barrack where two muscular soldiers in white coats stood on either side inside the door, grabbed us and pumped injection needles into our upper arms. I saw one of us pass out on the floor, and none of us really felt like laughing. We were passed on to a group of rough barbers who plonked us onto low stools and with electric shavers cut all the matted hair off our heads. When we came out, we could hardly recognize each other, and when I looked into a mirror, I could hardly recognize myself. It was awful. From there, we were shouted into shower rooms. When the warm, soft water ran down over our heads and emaciated bodies, there came a most lovely feeling of complete relaxation, which I had not known for years. It was as if all the nasty past, the hell I had been through, was washing away from me and running with a gurgling sound down into the grill beneath my feet. Even the soap was genuine, not the ersatz stuff which did not even foam, that had been our lot since the beginning of the war. We were each given a nice, clean towel, but when I picked it up to dry myself, I found that someone had pinched my wristwatch from underneath it. The moment in my life had arrived when I possessed absolutely nothing, and in a strange way it gave me a feeling of freedom which never in my life had I felt before. We lined up at a counter and were issued with underwear, socks, soft leather shoes, and an American khaki uniform, all of which was brand new. After all the dirt I had endured and had become used to for years, it was impossible to describe the feeling of fresh new clothes on the skin of my body. I stepped around, ran a few steps, shrugged my shoulders, bent over, threw my arms about and felt like a being newly reborn. From there we crossed a dark square, up a few steps and entered a well-lit dining room. On either side along the walls were long, clean tables with benches attached, and we were asked to sit down when German prisoners appeared from a counter to serve us with a full warm meal. It was one of the loveliest I have ever tasted. Few of us felt like talking, and someone opposite asked me to give him a kick so that he could be sure that he was alive. Afterwards, coffee was brought in from a large can, and real creamy milk and sugar, as much as we liked. And all this happened at about 3 o'clock in the morning. From there we were escorted into white wooden barracks. The floors creaked, everything was immaculately clean, the beds were spaciously arranged in rows, and had soft mattresses with clean bed linen and eiderdowns. The smell, the feeling, and all this for us, the prisoners. I put my head on the clean, soft pillow. There was no conversation, only hushed words as everyone was deep in his own thoughts. Someone switched the lights off, and I could see the beams of a white moon playing onto the foot of my bed. There was utter peace. Tired as I was, I wanted to lie there for a while and think. My thoughts went home to my mother. If only she could see me now, and I did not even know how she had come through the bombings and the end of the war, and whether she was even alive. And then my thoughts went back to Russia, without which the whole thought of the war and me now lying here in Arizona had no meaning. It was all part of each other. Slowly dropping off into dreamland, I thought of Adjets, walking with him down that potholed village street in Mankovo, of the old man in the hut, holding the hand of the little girl, of Anna and of Boris. What was the meaning of my life? We stayed at Florence for a few weeks. Though in the beginning I did not feel well, probably from the injections and the unaccustomed heat, I soon became alive again. We had little to do but eat and sleep, and in between we played football and chess and walked around camp in the cool evenings and talked about home. A fair German library had been set up in camp, probably provided by ex-compatriots living in the area, and I did a lot of reading. There were works by the great philosophers Kant, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, and I struggled through many, though having to admit that because of my insufficient education, I benefited little from their wisdom. Each afternoon, Arizona, a sandstorm, arrived and blew all around us. When we heard its howling and saw its dust cloud coming in from the desert, we quickly shut all the windows and doors. It never lasted more than a few minutes, but afterwards everything was covered with a thin layer of dust. On our arrival, the camp already contained several thousand prisoners, most of them from Rommel's Afrika Korps, and some of them were resentful towards us. They accused us of having thrown in the towel after the enemy had crossed into the fatherland. I too had quarrels with some of them, but having fought in Russia, I could easily stand my ground against them in argument. Conveniently trying not to mention that they themselves, after all, had thrown in the towel in Tunisia, they were still living in the clouds, protected by their Nazi blinkers. Although politically there had developed a splitting-off process, on the whole the Nazi elements still held sway. Habit, fear, and a robot-like discipline were the reasons, rather than any intellectual conviction. Shortly before we arrived, the camp Nazis had hanged a fellow prisoner from a beam in the lavatory because he had dared to openly speak out against Hitler and fascism. I was shown the place of his execution, which made me rather cautious in what I said. It also went around that American intelligence was not as anti-fascist as it was anti-communist, and there had been attempts by them to draw on the expertise of some of our worst war criminals. Generally, SS prisoners had little to fear in America, or as I later found out, in England. There was general pride amongst the patriots that there had been no rebellion against the government by the people, though the whole country of Germany was occupied by enemy troops. It was argued that it was a sign of our great racial maturity, but I could not agree with that anymore. I thought, though did not dare say it, that the people should have revolted in the face of the crimes which in the end must have been clear to all who had eyes to see. By that time Austria had become an independent country again, and one of the camp sections was reserved for Austrians only. A painted board had been placed at their camp entrance reading, "Nur für Österreicher, Reichsdeutsche unerwünscht," only for Austrians, Germans not wanted. Of course, it was an insult, and intended as such, and we assembled a troop every day and marched through their camp just to establish a point. After all, we were about 10,000 against their several hundred, and we loved to remind them that Hitler was an Austrian. That notwithstanding, however, the big camp event was the German versus Austria football match, which took place on a rough gravel pitch in the centre of the camp. Everyone came to that, and there was trouble on the terraces before the match had even started. In June, about 1,000 of us went by special train through Texas, along the eastern slopes of the Rockies through Colorado, and into the northern state of Montana. It was a very beautiful journey which took 3 days. Our camp was outside the town of Laurel by the side of the Yellowstone River, not far from the town of Billings. From the camp we could see the snow-covered peaks of the Yellowstone National Park. Every day we were taken out in working groups of about a dozen to hoe sugar beet plants on huge fields. Many of the farmers in that area were of German descent and were still able to speak German. As the handles of our shoes were only a foot long, it was a back-breaking job, and the sugar company's officials, who were in charge, tried all sorts of tricks to make us work harder, while at the same time they introduced a 10-day working week and cut our rations. As a result, several of us collapsed on the fields, and only our determination to drastically cut our efficiency restored our rations to something like normal. Once the hoeing was finished, we were taken on a train journey across Idaho, along the Columbia River, across Oregon with its forests of redwood trees into central California, to a camp near the town of Windsor, not far from Sacramento. The camp was beautifully situated amidst rolling green hills, and our square tents, sleeping 6 on mattressed beds, and which had a table and chairs in them, were very comfortable. The food was excellent in every respect. There was much too much to eat, and we worked well, picking hops and fruit in large plantations. With plenty of sport, music, drama, chess, etc., we organized our own recreation and received much help from the American YMCA, for whom I have not lost my gratitude to this day. Whenever there were days when we did not go out to work, there was trouble in the camp. We were all young and probably had too much energy. Out of sheer boredom, I assume, an older friend with the name of Fisher had a marvelous idea. He wanted to escape. He reasoned that the port of San Francisco was not far away, and that ships would sail from there to Latin America, where, he said, we Germans were welcome. Being bored, the 3 of us decided to go with him, and in our minds we already saw ourselves crossing the Andes from Chile into the pampas of Argentina, just like that. All that Fisher had organized was a pair of wire cutters, which probably had given him the idea to escape in the first place. The night of action arrived. With the American guards asleep, a couple of wires were quickly cut, and the 4 of us were in freedom. Each of us carried a small bag with food, soap, toothbrush, towel, etc. We walked for 3 or 4 miles, then dawn broke, and we decided to lie low and sleep in a hedge. This was a far cry from when I had slept rough about 2.5 years earlier, to the west of Stalingrad. We assured each other what a great feeling it was to be free, and wondered why we had not thought about it before. We woke up about midday and decided to walk individually to a nearby settlement, which we could see from our hedge, to find out the general situation. We left our bags in the hedge, and wearing workman's clothes, no one took any notice of us. Strolling around, we all met each other but gave no sign of recognition. As none of us spoke any decent English, I think we were all at a loss at what we were supposed to find out in that settlement anyway. It was very hot when I arrived back at the hedge, and when I parted the branches, there were 2 policemen sitting by our bags. They looked at me quite pleasantly, no even getting up, and invited me to sit down and join them. One by one, the others arrived and received the same treatment. One of the policemen told us that children had found our bags, and when they had phoned the camp, the guards were not even sure whether we were missing. When we arrived back in the camp, everyone, Germans and Americans, laughed about us. Reporting to the commandant, he did not even tell us off, but asked us whether we pleaded guilty to having stolen wire cutters and having cut 2 strands of wire which was government property. We got 3 days calabush for that. The Andes and Argentina had to wait, and I saw to it not to get involved with Fisher again. After the harvest in California was over, we travelled that same 2-day journey back to Montana and went into camp near the town of Harding. In working parties, we were taken by lorry as far as the Canadian border, and to the south into the state of Wyoming to harvest sugar beets. Our camp was not far from the Little Bighorn River, where General Custer had made his last disastrous stand. At times we worked in Red Indian reservations, and all of us, having read about Winnetou and Uncas, the last of the Mohicans, were rather disappointed at what we thought was the obvious degradation of the people. There was much drunkenness, bad housing, and cleanliness seemed sadly lacking. Once the work had been done, we travelled back to the Mexican border and arrived at a small working camp near Casa Grande, a Spanish-looking place right in the wilderness of Arizona. The camp was surrounded by rugged mountains of grotesque shapes rising out of the flat, dusty plain full of tall cactuses. From there we went cotton picking, right down to the Rio Grande. While racism had been a major ingredient in our theoretical upbringing, we had in fact very little practical experience of it. Where I had grown up, there had only been poor white working-class people. At Casa Grande, we found that we were the only white cotton pickers. All the others were either black or Mexicans who had come over the border and who often had trouble with the overseers and were badly underpaid. Food and life for us was good, but suddenly we received a severe jolt. A new camp commandant arrived. He ordered the entire camp to line up on the big square and made a speech in English which was translated into German sentence by sentence. He said that he was a Jew and proud of it. Several members of his family had suffered the worst in concentration camps, and he was now glad to be in a position to settle matters with us. He would see to it that we would receive the same quantity and quality of food which had been handed out in the concentration camps, and we would have to do the same workload. There would be no more sport, musical instruments would be withdrawn, our payments would be stopped, the washrooms closed, and only one standpipe would be in operation for the whole of the camp. I could understand his attitude, and did not complain. I just relate the facts. His program started the next morning. For breakfast we had a cup of black unsugared coffee and a dry bread roll. The food going with us on the lorries was equally miserable, and when we came back in the evening there was the same story. We had a chat round and then a meeting, and next day on the cotton fields we picked no more than a tenth of what we normally did. The farmers, who probably had to pay the camp for our work, wanted to know what the matter was. After arriving back in camp, it was very late that night when the dinner bell gonged, but there was a big meal on offer and a very good one, and none of us saw the Jewish camp commandant ever again. We celebrated Christmas at Casa Grande and rigged up a tree with real candles, around which we sang our traditional Christmas songs. Many American motorists stopped on the lonely highway outside the camp to listen to our singing, and clapped and asked for more. The nights at that time were very cold, and in the mornings the earth was covered with raw frost. We lit huge bonfires in the fields, around which we lazed in our thick coats until about 10. Minutes after, the sun had taken the frost off the cotton, and the farmers allowed us to start picking. Half an hour later our coats came off, and shortly after that the shirts as well. From there we were taken back to the main camp at Florence, where we were engaged in boring routine army camp work. One day, after he had chatted to me the day before, a friendly officer, Lieutenant Hightower, asked me whether I would like to work in the PX, American Army Shop and Canteen, as he probably thought that my English was good enough for that. I would have agreed to anything which would take me out of camp. Next morning I reported to the gate and was taken by a guard to the PX. It was like a big department store, in which everything imaginable could be bought. I had anticipated that I would work in the stores or as a cleaner or general handyman, and was much surprised when I was taken into Lieutenant Hightower's office, where he asked me if I could type. I couldn't. "You will have to learn then," he said. "Are you good at figures?" "Reasonably," I replied. He then took me to a large writing desk in the corner by the window and told me that it was mine to work on. Well, I thought, how about that? Apart from me and Hightower, who had his desk behind a partition, there were 2 girls in the office who also had their own desks. They were about my age, made me very welcome from the first, and assured me of all the help I should need. I had little money myself, but they saw to it that in the breaks I had as many cakes and other goodies as they themselves had. Officially, I was not allowed any alcohol, but, thanks to the girls, I had beer every day. Never having worked in an office before, I felt bewildered in the beginning, but I soon learned to type and what to do with the filing cabinets, calculating machine, invoices, stamp machine, and so on. I tried my hardest, because I wanted to do the job efficiently. When Hightower wanted me, he simply shouted Henry from behind the partition, and I rushed in, with, "Yes, Lieutenant." He often wrote rough letters by hand, which I then had to type. I enjoyed work there tremendously, and hated the weekends when I could not go into the office. Apart from being his secretary, I also acted as his doorman. It happened sometimes that visitors without an appointment objected to being barred from coming into the office by a German prisoner. I lauded it all right when it suited me, and whenever there were complaints in that respect, Hightower, not to mention the girls, always backed me to the hilt. I worked in the office for about 2 months and regretted it a bit that the two girls were watching each other. They were both fine persons. We came to know each other very well. They helped me greatly, and I repaid by covering up for them and taking the blame for the mistakes they sometimes made. The announcement that we were going to leave Florence Camp was a hard blow for me. On my last day, the girls arranged an office party in my honour, to which only Hightower and a few others were invited. The desk in the middle was covered with a white tablecloth, and on it were cakes the girls had baked for me, and glasses and bottles, and Hightower, screwing his face a tiny bit at first, did not object. Everyone gave a little speech with a toast, and when it came to me, I was hardly able to say anything, because I had a great big lump in my throat. But my friends understood and came into my arms to hug and kiss me, and there were a few embarrassed tears, with Hightower again showing no objection. As a final act, I had to hand in my gate permit card, and then both girls took me back to that ugly fence, snuggling lovingly against me. The gate guards did not like what they saw coming towards them. One of them was rude, but received a vicious lashing from the girls' tongues. It being a dark night, the guards shone the full power of the searchlight onto our parting scene. Once inside the camp, I walked along the barbed wire, while the girls walked parallel with me on the outside. We laughed and waved, threw kisses and gave all sorts of promises with hope for the future. Oh, how I hated that fence. Once a week, a re-educational meeting took place in the large canteen. Most of us went, though attendance was not compulsory. A German-speaking American chairman opened up with a short introduction, and then it was mainly up to us to discuss anything of interest or topical. Feelings often ran high in this attempt to introduce us to democratic values, and we were encouraged to speak our minds without fear, which was not an easy thing for us to do. As the war had been over now for quite some time, critical remarks about our own actions and policies now came slowly to the fore. What struck me was that the Nazis were always sitting at the back of the hall, and though engaged in much heckling, seldom contributed anything thoughtful. I never liked to stand up under all the eyes and say my part, but when one day an elderly prisoner urged the audience to be realistic and truthful and accept that horrible crimes against humanity had been committed by us, all hell broke loose at the back, with someone saying, "Ah, well, that was war." I raised my arm from sheer excitement, regretted it in an instant, but was called by the American chairman to speak. At first stuttering a bit, I challenged forcefully that if that was so, then we should think about the origins of war and not accept it unthinkingly without asking questions. We all knew, I claimed, that a war must have economic, financial, social and industrial roots, and that enormous profits had been made out of it, while others had paid with their lives, and that if we truly wanted to stop another one from breaking out again, then we must look for those roots. There was much hissing from the back, but no one challenged me. But when I walked away afterwards, a group of Nazis stopped me and told me in no uncertain terms to shut my stupid trap in the future. Had I not been a member of the camp football team, they would have given me a good hiding there and then. The next trip took us to the Californian Pacific coast. The transport was by road and covered a distance of several hundred miles. While most of us travelled on the backs of lorries, I was lucky and travelled with 2 of my mates in a jeep driven by a private, who after a short while simply announced that he would change over into another jeep to be with his friend, and that I, who had told him that I could drive, was to drive this one. A German mate swapped over from the other jeep, and the 4 of us rolled along the smooth American highway. It did not take long before our convoy of about 100 vehicles lost all cohesion. We were now as good as on our own, and I was the only one who could drive and also who could speak English. And all I knew was that I was to drive west into California to a place called March Camp. There was busy traffic, and soon we were leaving the flat desert and climbed on a winding road into the beauty of the border mountains. We observed a most marvellous golden sunset. To my surprise, when arriving at the border, there were customs officials, and all cars had to stop. The idea was that no one was allowed to take fruit across the border. When our official realized that he was dealing with a jeepload of unguarded German POWs, he ordered us to the side and called his superior. They made a few phone calls, scratched their heads, and then let us proceed on our journey west. Like this incident, I found much in America refreshingly uncomplicated, though not always very efficient. It was already pitch dark when we entered the wider Los Angeles region, and at one time we got hopelessly lost. A friendly American directed us in his car to an army road sign to March Camp, and when we finally got there in the early hours of the morning, I was dead beat, and all I wanted was to lie down and sleep. The camp, of which the POW cage was only a small part, was of enormous size, with its own airfield, hospital, and what seemed like a town of its own. We were several thousand strong, and amongst us were well-known musicians, artists, and others, and we had our own symphony orchestra, which gave many good performances in a large festival hall to full houses, including many American servicemen and their families. All the work we were needed for was within the camp, and was boring. But food and sunshine was plentiful, and there was all kinds of sport, especially football, so we were getting into peak condition. It troubled us greatly that we had had no news from Germany whatsoever, none of us. The war had been over for more than a year, and we were not allowed to write. In the summer of 1946, we each received a card issued from the Vatican, which we filled in with our names only to show we were alive. But none of our relatives ever received them. On top of the card was the heading Ein Angehöriger der geschlagenen Armee sucht seine Angehörigen. A member of the beaten army is looking for his relatives. It was only very much later, from England, that my mother, who had been officially informed that I had gone missing and was probably dead, received my first communication after a dreadful time of worry. At about that time, my war wounds, shrapnel in the leg, caught up with me and caused much pain and high temperature. I was taken to a military hospital, received excellent treatment and all possible care, and recuperated after several weeks. With winter at the door, we left sunny California and travelled back to New York, crossing the whole of the North American continent in 3 days. It was cold and damp when we were unloaded at the huge army complex of Camp Shanks. Our stay there lasted for several weeks, and being sure that we were now going home, all of us became rather impatient. When finally we walked up the gangway of the troop ship, we were told by the officers that we would be taken to Bremerhaven, to be released from captivity. Compared with our westward crossing in convoy, this was almost luxurious, and took only 1 week. Everyone had his own comfortable bunk bed, and to a large extent the freedom of the ship throughout the 24 hours of the day. When we arrived at Liverpool, we naturally assumed that it would only be a port of call on our journey. But we were suddenly ordered to take all our belongings and line up on deck. Meanwhile, a number of British personnel came on board. There was friendly handshaking with their American counterparts, and we were marched down the gangway, then boarded a train which took us through Manchester to Altrincham in Cheshire. The war had been over for well over a year, but when we were marched through the camp gates outside that town, we woke up to the fact that the Americans had sold us like slaves to the British. We 3 were the first to arrive, apart from 2 British sergeants who had to arrange the material preparations. A couple of long tables, flanked by chairs on either side, had been set up lengthwise in the hut. The windows were high in the bent ceiling, and the atmosphere, smelling of officialdom, gave me a gloomy foreboding. While we were offered tea and biscuits and talked quietly with each other, our nerves were very much on edge, and we could hear the humming noise of our 1,000 mates outside. Then, about 5 minutes late, the British delegation arrived. They had come in a car from outside the camp. All 3 were officers, and one of them, who carried several books under his arm, was a lawyer. Behind them came a girl with a writing block, who sat down at the end of the table. It was all a bit overwhelming, as we had no books, no writing material, nothing, not even a prepared plan for anything. The senior officer, a colonel, opened up. They all introduced themselves, and we did the same. Though they behaved correctly in every way, the whole stark difference of presentation made me feel as if we had walked into a lion's den. The colonel said something about the weather, and trusted that we had had a pleasant Atlantic crossing. He mentioned that he had recently been to Germany, and that in his view conditions there were already improving. He asked which of us 3 was the leader. We had not even thought about that, perhaps assuming that democratic processes should mean that was unnecessary. While all of us were about 23 or 24 years old, our opposites were much more mature and experienced in things like this, and as my English was probably slightly better than that of my mates, we decided that I should be the leader. "All right, Obergefreiter," said the colonel, looking at me very sternly. "What is it all about?" "Well," I said, "Colonel, the Americans obviously have released us from captivity, but they have done so in the wrong place. This is England and not Germany." "That's right. Thank you for reminding me of it. But what's wrong with it?" "Everything, Colonel. The war is over for more than a year. Not one of us 1,000 men has fought against you British. You just can't take us prisoners like that. It's peacetime now. No one must do that." "Who says so?" "I say so. And we all think so." "And who are you?" "Obergefreiter Mettelmann of the German Wehrmacht." Following that, he scratched his head, screwed up his face as if he was annoyed, and looked over to the lawyer, asking him about the legal position of it all. The latter, who had been laughing and seemed somewhat unprepared, cut his cackle short and started looking through one of his thick books. Then he seemed to have a bright idea. "On what, Obergefreiter, do you base your contention?" Of course I had no idea, and looking at my mates, they did not seem to have one either. But then I shot out with the only thought I had and said, "Geneva Convention." "Right," the lawyer major said, smiling all over his face and realizing probably that I had walked into the trap good and proper. "What section and what article of the convention are you referring to?" Well, I was conquered, and what was more, I knew it. And when I looked at my mates, I saw only empty faces. "Well, that's it then," said the colonel, and he mumbled something about wasting valuable time for nothing. Directing his gaze at me, he said, "And the next time you make an official complaint to which we are good enough to listen, please prepare it properly. If I were you, Obergefreiter, with your history behind you, I would not mention the Geneva Convention ever again." All that I could do was stare back at him in defiance, and thought it better to let it be. The meeting was now closed, and we all filed out into the sunny morning. But now the Black SS wanted to know, "When are we going home? When are we going home?" My two mates, being crafty buggers, pointed to me to come out with the answer. Afterwards there was howling and shouting, some whistling and some nasty words, saying that it was all my fault. It was there and then on those steps of the Nissen hut that I decided never again to act as a democratic spokesman for anyone ever again. Soon we were split up, and with about 200 or 300 I was put on a train transport south, and arrived on a dark night in the town of Romsey in Hampshire. England from the train window had been interesting to observe, especially as we had come straight from America with Germany, France and Russia strong in our minds. In many ways England was a strange country. That narrow channel of water seemed to have made much difference over the centuries. Most things seemed small and old-fashioned. The rows and rows of houses in the towns, with their small backyards and gardens, seemed cramped. The people were friendly enough, but strangely reserved, and life generally had an unhurried flow, so very different from America and the continent of Europe. And yet there was something likeable about it all. From Romsey Camp we worked on farms all over Hampshire and beyond. We had accepted our fate now, worked hard and caused no trouble. Those who lived out on the farms had very good relations with the farming people, and on the whole were treated very well. From Romsey, I was transferred to an outcamp in a beautiful old country house called Hazelhurst, near the village of Cohampton. It did me much psychological good, as it gave me a feeling of freedom which I had not had for many years. From Hazelhurst I was transferred to a camp near the small town of Bishop's Waltham, and was employed to work in the garden of a family in the lovely village of West Meon, where I was treated with much understanding and friendliness. It made me especially happy to be with the children, who were always lovingly around me. From Bishop's Waltham we were taken to a camp just outside Southampton in 1948, almost 3 years after the war had ended, and from there I was released from captivity shortly after. From the age of 18 to 26, probably the most formative years of anyone's life, I had been a soldier and a prisoner, and there had been many moments when I wished that I had never been born. Suddenly I was set free like a bird, unused to it, and I found it difficult at first. In me was a great feeling of guilt, but also anger, frustration, and disappointment. How was I to come to terms with all that? A prisoner transport took me back to Germany. My parents were now both dead. Everything we had been destroyed in the bombings. The clothes I stood up in and the blue American kit bag I carried on my shoulder were my only possessions. What was I now to do with my life? Before I left England, I had been assured by Colonel Courage, the brewer, for whom I had worked as a farm worker, that if I ever wanted to come back to England and work for him, he would welcome me back. Germany irritated me. There was no attempt even to talk about the war and what had happened and why. I had no home. There was much unemployment and I felt lost and alone. And when a close relative told me that the defeat of Germany was the fault of people like me who had had no faith in the Führer and who had not given their all in the struggle, I had had enough. I took my kit bag and went back to England after only 4 weeks. Working on Colonel Courage's farms near Crondall and Preston Candover, and playing football for the Bentley Village team, I slowly felt I was returning into the circle of humanity. Then the Colonel employed a lovely au pair girl from Switzerland. In those peaceful and beautiful surroundings in that Hampshire village, how could we help falling in love? We married in Switzerland in 1952. In 1954, a son was born to us, and in 1956, a girl. I started to work as a railway porter at Alton, became a signalman, and then stayed on until my recent retirement. My dear wife died in 1980. The feeling of guilt for what in a collective way I have done to others, especially the people of Russia, lies very heavily on me. Coming to the evening of my life now, I sometimes wonder what it has been: a drama, a tragedy, a crime, or a comedy. I cannot be quite sure. I have regrets for the suffering I have caused others, but no complaints about what others have done to me.